A few weeks ago, I went grocery shopping for the first time in about a month. The first store I had been to since about early March. I was lined up outside with other eager shoppers, all alone, each waiting for our turn to enter the store. Most had face masks on, some had gloves. I myself had a mask. I had my phone in a little plastic baggie. I had hand sanitizer in a jacket pocket that I probably used a little bit too much, if that's even possible. When I got inside, the silence of the store, it was almost deafening. The automated announcements came on the intercom, "Please remain 6 feet apart." And it gave me apocalyptic style chills. I wasn't afraid, but everything felt so foreign. This wasn't the world that I was used to. In these moments, I felt small. The world was not as I had known it only a little while ago, and while I was infused with hope by the cooperation and respectfulness from fellow customers, and I know that that's not always the case, I still felt entirely unsettled. Today we are in the book of Acts, which tells the stories of the early Christian church, a gathering of people who too found themselves in unprecedented times. Their world had suddenly shifted. Having awaited the Messiah for centuries, he had now come, lived, ministered, died, resurrected, and ascended to heaven. And now it was time to figure out their next steps, how to live their faith in new, innovative ways, bringing along those who had walked with God faithfully for years, as well as reaching out to new people beyond the walls of the culture and tradition that had previously bound them. And so the early Christian church was born out of fire and a necessity for a new way of living. They chose leaders. They bound themselves together in community, seeking the common good. But like any group of people who tries to work together, even on the best of terms, they encountered obstacles, clashes in priorities. One of the concerns was that of the widows of the Greeks were not being cared for and provided resources like the Jewish women were. Responding to this problem, the disciples realized that they were growing in numbers and there was more work than they could bear. So they selected 7 men to oversee the distribution of food. One of these, chosen for character, wisdom, and faith, was named Stephen. Stephen's job was simple and fairly straightforward based on what we know. But as the news of Jesus continued to spread, so did his boldness. We don't know exactly what Stephen did to draw so much attention to himself, great wonders and signs, wisdom, and the spirit with which he spoke. That's all that we really know. But whatever it was he did or said, it didn't sit well with some of the religious leaders. Now, where have we heard that story before? Much like the example he followed, Stephen was arrested, brought before the council, and false witnesses testified against him. With only months since Jesus' own arrest and crucifixion, he must have realized the danger that he was in and the seriousness of the accusations against him. But unlike Jesus, who was mostly vague and silent in response to the questions, Stephen is anything but quiet. Maybe he was hoping he could do what Peter had done, recently addressing a curious crowd and gaining 3,000 followers in the process. But instead of an emotional appeal like Peter, he gives this lengthy speech, more of a historical recap from Abraham to Joseph, Moses to David and Solomon, ending suddenly with a righteous anger funneled through insults and accusations of his own. Given that this gathering wasn't exactly disposed toward hearing him out in the first place, this didn't bode very well for him. And today, I might advise my friend that he would catch more flies with honey than vinegar. But I'm not entirely sure that catching flies was his goal. Maybe Stephen knew that this was the end for him, and he was determined to say what he wanted to say, bearing witness not for himself, but for Jesus. Admittedly, through some rather harsh words you didn't hear Kevin read earlier. And then through a vision of Jesus standing at the right hand of God. And whether he knew it or not at the time, this was the end for Stephen. For he is best known for being the first martyr of the Christian church. Now I realize that martyrdom is a really weird thing to be preaching about today, especially when the weight of what's going on in the world already feels so heavy. I mean, just going to the grocery store feels risky right now. And honestly, I'm fairly uncomfortable preaching about martyrdom any day, but probably not for the reasons that you'd think. I've never felt legitimately threatened because I'm a Christian. Sure, my theology has been challenged in some pretty intense ways, but never fundamentally because I call myself a Christian. I have no doubt that there are instances of true religious persecution against Christians in the United States and around the world. But this is not the overwhelming narrative. Christians historically have far more often sat in a place of privilege, throwing stones rather than enduring them. So I'm not uncomfortable talking about martyrdom and persecution because I fear it to be a likely scenario for myself. I'm uncomfortable because we glorify the perception of it today in ways that are unhelpful and even harmful to the true witness of Jesus Christ. But that doesn't mean we can't learn from the example of Stephen, who faced true persecution and even death with fearless confidence. He knew he wasn't going to change the minds of his audience immediately, but that didn't cause him to alter his message. Being a Christian today rarely requires martyrdom or persecution, but Christ does call us to be authentic and courageous witnesses, to share our stories of faith, to serve others even when it's uncomfortable, to step out into the unknown and trust that God will use us in ways that go beyond our own small parts in the grand narrative. Because even if our well-being isn't threatened for it, following Christ isn't easy. Sharing our journeys with others who need to hear our testimonies isn't always comfortable. Speaking the truth isn't always what we want to do. Taking the high road isn't always pleasant. Taking a stand for others isn't always in our own personal best interest. Making even the smallest sacrifices isn't always something that feels like it makes a difference. But these are the things that gathered together make us witnesses for Jesus Christ. Our faith calls us to carefully measure what we say and what we do, sharing God's love despite ourselves. Sometimes being a witness is as simple as moving church services online and showing up in our living rooms to continue worshiping God during a pandemic. Sometimes it's as easy as joining with widespread efforts that care for the global community, wearing masks, staying home when we can, using resources to care for those in need, going to the grocery store alone. And sometimes it's less simple. Sharing boldly what God has put on our hearts, listening and responding with grace and wisdom to those who have different priorities. Putting the needs of the poor, the outcast, the marginalized, the neglected ahead of what we want for ourselves. Following Christ in ways that are not always pretty for reasons that are not really about us at all. But whether we are just a little unsettled or entirely uprooted in our efforts to bear witness to the work of God, we must remember that ultimately, God has already won. Stephen knew this even before he saw the vision of Christ, and we know it too. We are given instead a unique and beautiful opportunity to participate in God's work, boldly following God here and now, sharing God's love without fear. And so no matter how small you may feel, no matter how insignificant your words and actions may seem in the moment, your witness leaves a legacy that stretches, weaving into a future beyond what you will probably ever come to know in this lifetime. In the case of Stephen, as he took his final breath, there was a man who looked on approvingly. This man was Saul, who would later go on to become one of the most influential leaders of early Christianity, the Apostle Paul. I wonder what our own legacy will be. I wonder what parts we will play in God's ongoing work. I wonder what stories will emerge from these strange days that will be handed down through generations. Stories of bravery and boldness, of speaking the truth in love, of concern for neighbor above our own comforts, of bearing witness to Christ through creativity and innovation. We may never know the full answer, but each day presents us with an opportunity to live as witnesses to the hope found in Jesus. Sometimes tedious and small, sometimes frightening and large, but always, always important pieces in the grand legacy, the legacy of faithfulness and love that we hope to leave for generations to come. So I pray, in times of discomfort, may we be agile. In situations of prosperity, may we be generous. In seasons of uncertainty, may we stand as reminders of God's promises. In the face of fear, may we be people of hope. In every day that we live and breathe, may we stand as witnesses to the unending love of Jesus Christ. Amen.